As soon as I start recording a podcast, a siren comes up in the background. There you go, I'm not stopping now. This podcast is a good one because it's recorded with my practitioner. We talk about symptoms and diagnosis, and specifically histamine and mold. This is Zestology with a police siren in the background. Hi, I'm Tony. I'm an author, presenter at Sky Sports, and years ago I went to the jungle and got ill. Very ill. So this is my podcast adventure to find more energy. It's packed with biohacking, science, health tech, supplements, and some of the most well-known experts on the planet.
This is something I spent 4 months of my life doing with electrodes glued to my head so that you can do a lifetime worth of meditation.
Decide what you don't give a fuck about, which is something you don't care about.
Some of it gets quite out there.
I had some stem cells sent up to my house that I had stored, and then I injected myself with mannitol.
And we even hack hangovers.
Alcohol is poisonous. So is water and oxygen in the wrong dosage.
So that's my podcast, Zestology. Live life with energy, vitality, and motivation. Yes, hello, welcome back to Zestology, the podcast all about energy and vitality. And obviously I've spoken about histamine quite a bit in the past on this podcast. And, as a passion project, as a side project, I manage and run and host the Histamine Intolerance site and Histamine Intolerance site Instagram. And I really enjoy doing that. And I really do it on the side because I suffer from it, and as a journalist I've enjoyed applying my journalistic skills to getting information out there much more about a condition which until recently really wasn't understood well at all, and even now is growing in awareness, but it's hard to find a practitioner, and I'm very lucky to have a good practitioner. So it's a bit windy today as I record this podcast. Hope it's not too windy as you listen to it, but I know I said that last week as well. So today I am speaking to Caroline Sherlock. She's my practitioner, and I've made great strides in dealing with my histamine intolerance with her. I just feel so much better than I used to. And we're talking about two things today. Histamine intolerance, don't switch off if you don't think you've got it, because the second thing is mold, and I am shocked at how much mold can impact people's lives. I just recently got a very in-depth test, probably the best type of test of its type in the world, and yeah, I've got mold exposure, mycotoxin exposure. So let's dive into that. This is in-depth health analysis with my practitioner Caroline Sherlock. Hi Caroline, how are you?
I am very well, thank you.
Good. Very pleased to be doing this podcast with my own practitioner.
I know, and I'm very excited to be able to talk about histamine.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it's been such a great experience working with you, and I've had plenty of false starts with functional health and functional medicine practitioners in the start. So it has been brilliant, and I often get people get into touch and say, "Oh, who would you recommend?" And I mention you. I'm hoping you're going to be inundated. In fact, I know you're normally inundated anyway, so you'll have too many people to know what to do with. But just start by explaining to people what you do. And obviously, I've already prefaced this by saying you do specialise in histamine, but that's not the only thing you do, is it?
No, it's not. And I've been a nutritionist for sort of nearly 20 years now, which is a little bit scary. And I've always really liked being a generalist. And it's only really the last 5 years or so where I have just navigated myself into this world of histamine. And it's really the more I did with functional medicine. So I certified with the Institute of Functional Medicine in the States in 2017 now, and just really started looking much, much more at the root cause, which we've always done, but just really diving down deep into people's symptoms and what's going on. And what I was finding was that the people that came to me had been around the houses already. So they'd seen multiple practitioners, doctors, been told that all their tests were normal. They'd maybe done a few kind of adrenal tests or gut tests and done little bits, but still had these symptoms that were continuing. And I, at the same time, when I first started looking into genetics and when all the genetic testing companies came out with their labs, I worked with pretty much all of them, but there were a couple that started running histamine reports, and I just ran my own genes as, I do with every single test. I run myself and my family through things just to see what comes out. and was actually shocked with myself in terms of my genetics around histamine. And I started looking into it in much more depth and discovered that it can just link so many different symptoms that I had experienced, that I'd seen my mother in particular experience, my children experience, and it all started to make sense.
Yeah.
And so I started to go into that area. And then over the last few years, a lot of the histamine intolerance, I guess, area has become much more popular because there's been, people such as yourself promoting it, which is wonderful. But also there's been a big overlap with COVID and the pandemic and the sorts of symptoms and activating a lot of histamine pathways. So there's been much more media attention and press around it. And so I've just ended up really pretty much exclusively now working in the area of histamine and mast cell activation and environmental toxins, with this kind of general focus on brain fog and gut issues and food sensitivities and all the other myriad of symptoms that you can find with histamine intolerance.
Yeah. And, I started the histamine intolerance site and Instagram just as a little side project.
Yeah.
Really. And it still is, because I'm not a practitioner, so I can't actually really make money out of it. And if I could, I'd be doing great, because I get more people following than I do on my normal site. I'll pass it on to you instead. So, so I think, there is a real thirst. It's a real pain point for people, because it's a confusing condition. It's not like gluten, where you can read a label and whether you're eating something that's got gluten in it or not. And then the list of symptoms is so wide as well, that it's a bit of a head fuck to get your head around it, isn't it?
It really is. It totally is. And I think the additional confusing factor is that you've then got so many blogs and really strict histamine diets out there that people find really, really hard to follow, and they don't understand, and they end up limiting their diets really quite severely in some cases, which then means that they don't get the nutrients that they need to get into their diets to actually recover and nourish themselves and get well. And that's one of the big things that I see, and this anxiety around, oh my God, I've got histamine intolerance and I can't eat this ever again. I can't, have a glass of wine. I can't eat any chocolate or a banana. It's just, my view is that it's incorrect to assume that that is your life, forever once you've discovered this thing, because I don't believe it is at all. I eat absolutely everything. I'm fine. I monitor how I am. My genetics are probably amongst the worst that I've seen amongst histamine intolerance. But it doesn't have to be that way. It's actually understanding beneath it what's causing it.
Yeah. Well, it's good. I mean, the thing is, when you've got an issue in a particular area, that's when you're motivated to look into it. Especially with histamine intolerance, I would imagine that it would be quite hard for a practitioner to specialize in that area if you didn't have it or have someone in the family with it anyway.
Yeah, because it just covers so many things, as do, many other areas. And particularly, I guess, with women who are maybe kind of perimenopausal, menopausal, you've got hormones that react with it, and then everything's put down to the menopause and just told that by their doctors. And there's so much more when you actually dig down into it, into what's going on with people's bodies, and so many easy ways that you can reset them, so that actually an issue with histamine and eating higher histamine foods shouldn't be that issue if in the long term at all.
Yeah. It's weird, isn't it? Because I know that I've been suffering with histamine intolerance in some way for over 20 years.
Yeah.
And yet, I don't think even the term histamine intolerance really existed 20 years ago. That's what's so mad about it.
I remember vaguely hearing about it when we were studying and looking into it a little bit and just thinking, no, there's no, park that. That's just ridiculous. And I think I would agree with you. And even, to people who don't know much about it, I think it's still put down to, have you got hay fever, seasonal allergies? That's what you would need an antihistamine for. Therefore, that's histamine intolerance. And it's just so much more than that. It's not an allergy at all. Yeah. It's just a very real set of symptoms due to your body having problems breaking down histamine. And that can be exacerbated by a lack of sleep, by stress, by just eating really poorly as well. So, there's so many different things that can impact it. And I think that's where it's a little bit of an art, trying to understand for each individual person, what is it? Is it a hormonal imbalance? Is it you've got gut problems? Is it you're just actually loading up on, high histamine smoothies, which was the thing, you go back maybe 3-4 years ago, maybe it still is a little bit now, but the amount of people who were blending or juicing kind of bananas, spinach, strawberries, or, all in, for breakfast.
Avocado.
Yeah, and the avocado in there. Avocado for everything too. Exactly. And you just look at it and think, well, there you go. That's just take that out. It's too much of a good thing in that case for that person at that time. It's not to say you can't ever have that, but just at that particular time, not helping.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I'm sort of, first since discovering the concept of histamine intolerance, and especially since working with you, I feel sort of 80 to 90% better. And we're still not quite there, but as you know, we're sort of going deeper into it now. I'm really excited about that. We can go into the reasons for why people might be histamine intolerant in a second, but just in terms of those symptoms, you mentioned gut and brain fog and allergy-like symptoms, even though it's not an allergy. But there's a lot of other stuff. And as you say, a lot of women who are perimenopausal or menopausal might go through changes in how they deal with histamine as well.
That's true. And because one of the mechanisms, obviously, of releasing histamine is that you have these things called mast cells in the body. And estrogen is a very potent activator of the mast cells. So the mast cells have these receptors on as well. And when the mast cells are triggered, they can release histamine. So estrogen rising, and this is typically what we see around perimenopause, the hormones fluctuate all over the place. And so if you suddenly have a big surge of estrogen, it can exacerbate histamine symptoms. And it tends to happen normally at certain other points in the cycle. And for instance, women who premenstrually get migraines as well, that's a big factor. It can also happen with teenage girls when the hormones are all over the place, or when someone's going on HRT or contraceptive pills. Sometimes that can aggravate things a little bit depending on how sensitive they are. So it really is a big thing for women, actually. And then how you metabolize, how your gut's working, how you get the hormones out, your whole detox pathways have to be working well as well, in order to make sure that the hormones, the estrogen, isn't recycled around the body, because otherwise it's kind of a bit of a double whammy. So you want your liver to be working well, the hormones balanced, and that in itself for some women can just relieve the pressure, I guess, on the histamine. Because if you think of histamine like a bucket, it's all just to do with how much of that bucket is full. And so hormonally, women around perimenopause or menopause really have a hard hit on that bucket as well.
Yeah, and not just looking at the menopause and perimenopause, but anyone looking at symptoms that they could sort of can't quite explain and they're going through, which is a lot of people actually. It's sort of like, it's just so hard to, some of the tests that you've had me do, interpreting them is just so complicated that I think it is really hard for people. And then you talk about genetics as well and genetic pathways. It's just a collection of letters put in a random order on a page, isn't it? And it is very hard for somebody to interpret those results without the help of a practitioner, which is a shame, but good for you, I guess.
I think it is. And I think the standard histamine tests that you could do, I don't run those because your histamine levels fluctuate throughout the day. So I don't particularly see a point in running those tests at all. It's much better to actually get functional tests around, do you need more of particular nutrients? And those nutrients might help to break down histamine. That's of much more value. Have you got a gut microbiome that's got bugs in it that release histamine? Because if so, that's not helpful. You want to rebalance your microbiome. It's much more relevant to have those tests. And then genetics are just genetics. It can be useful to see, and it's certainly super useful in terms of the pathways, because the testing company that I use now just does some beautiful visuals around how we break down histamine in the body. And just for those alone, you can see where your predispositions are, so if your pathways look like they've got blockages at certain points, we know how we can upregulate certain genes to actually help the breakdown of histamine. And that's the value in doing it. But yeah, it's a real art, because otherwise you get all these symptoms, and going back to the hormonal side with women as well, it's why looking at a clinical history is so important, because you have women frequently reporting with kind of menstrual cramps and this kind of, is it endometriosis they've suffered with all their lives? So many other different things, facial flushing, intolerance of alcohol sometimes, dizziness, vertigo, anxiety, insomnia, the list goes on. And it's only by taking a really comprehensive clinical picture to begin with that you can start to see some of those patterns emerging over time, and particularly at points in the life when people are stressed or have additional burdens or loads on them, then their histamine rises, and then it'll fall away again.
Totally. Interrupting this podcast for one moment to remind you that my podcast partners today are BiOptimizers and Magnesium Breakthrough. If you would like a shortcut to better sleep, more energy, and a calmer, more stable mood, and who wouldn't want that, then you need to make sure you're supplementing with magnesium daily, but not any magnesium, because about 75% of us are magnesium deficient, but there are actually 7 unique forms of magnesium. You need to get all of them if you want to experience its calming, health-enhancing effects. That is why I recommend Magnesium Breakthrough by BiOptimizers. And I took one probably about an hour ago. I take it twice a day sometimes, maybe once so far today, but often twice a day. It's the only organic, that's important, full spectrum magnesium supplement that includes 7 unique forms of magnesium. And, I've been partnering with BiOptimizers for a couple of years now, and they've had a couple of months off the podcast, and they are now back, and I'm very pleased about that. So you can go to magbreakthrough.com/zestology. And even when they weren't partnering with me, I was still taking Magnesium Breakthrough. Go to magbreakthrough.com/zestology, and you can get a discount if you use Zestology10. And that works worldwide as well. If you're in the UK, you can go to the UK BiOptimizers site and use that same discount code, Zestology10. So better sleep, more energy, stronger bones, healthier blood pressure. For me, it helps me sleep at night and relax, and definitely get less inflamed as well. Use the code Zestology10 at the website magbreakthrough.com/zestology. Now back to the show. It's just so interesting that the stress component, and it's not even, stress isn't quite the right word. Sometimes it's just life intensity.
Yes.
We last spoke, didn't we? And I was in Thailand.
I
And
know.
said, I've been feeling better than ever before.
I know.
He said, well, I'm not really surprised because you're living in Thailand, but also then you unveiled my latest test results, which were, we can talk about mold a little bit. And that's the reason that the 18 to 90% isn't 100%. I scored very highly on some mycotoxins, didn't I? Which is down to potentially having mold in your house or a previous house.
Correct. So mycotoxins are toxins produced by mold. So when you have mold, and when we think of mold, we think of kind of damp, moldy walls where you can see it. Doesn't need to be that way. Basically, anywhere that's had water damage for kind of 24, 48 hours and isn't dried out super quickly can accumulate mold depending on the substrate it's on. So the modern building materials, as we were talking about before, things like plasterboard, are just perfect. Carpet, if you've got water damage, a leaking radiator gathers in the carpet, and then if you add it onto it a little bit of humidity as well, it just grows and it stays there quite happily, but when people try to provoke it or clean it off, or in some cases it will just emit these spores anyway, and it also emits other things, bacteria, so it's certainly not just the mycotoxins, but the mycotoxins are extremely damaging to our health. And the net effect is that they promote a histamine response in the body by aggravating the mast cells. So it's like your body's in overdrive. It's trying to activate your immune system, create all this inflammation in the body. And if you've still got an exposure somewhere in your house, that's the problem, because you've got this constant provoking of the mast cells and histamine release, and you can do all you want with a low histamine diet, and shove a load of supplements in. But actually, if that's the problem, then you need to solve the problem, which would be actually getting proper advice over, a damp wall or a patch of damp in the corner of a bathroom that's just sat there. And I think the problem, Tony, in this country is we just think it's damp, we just think, okay, it's a bit damp, it's a bit of mold in the shower, everyone has it. That's that. And it shouldn't be like that. We shouldn't be living in houses that have damp in or have been damaged in the past. And so much of this stuff is behind the walls as well,
Yeah,
so it's
you're right.
it's
I mean,
yeah, it's a
I
real
I hadn't really thought about it until you mentioned it. Even though I've been quite conscious of mold as an issue in the past.
yeah.
I know I'm quite sensitive to mold if I walk into a room. And then we got back to our house after our trip, and I saw a little bit of black mold on the grouting in our shower. I hadn't even noticed it before, but obviously I noticed it after you and I had talked about it. I mean, I guess that's the sort of thing, but it's just hard, isn't it? Because I know one of your big things is that, and you just mentioned it with food, not to get too obsessed about stuff. But it's
Yep.
quite hard with mold because you can't even see it.
You can't. And I think what we want to get people to is where you're living in harmony with molds, because molds are in nature, they're everywhere in the garden. You're not going to ever evade molds, and we probably shouldn't be either. But what you want to get to is a place where it's not physically affecting your health. And I think there's been so much research around animals and contaminated feed for animals in terms of mycotoxins. So that's where a lot of the research has arisen from. And it's really only been the last, I would say, 5 years where it started to come to the forefront. And even the tests that we have, we're only testing at the moment for maybe 14 different mycotoxins. There are many, many more that affect us.
Wow.
But this is as good as it gets at the moment. So I think this area is in its infancy. But the problem with it is any mycotoxin, it just doesn't want to be disturbed. It wants to set up in your body, live in your body, sit there and just be nice and happy. So as part of that, it can suppress the immune system.
Yes.
So it downregulates so that it can survive. So with any fungal overgrowth or yeast, then they just want to survive. They want to be nice and cozy in a warm area and just left alone. And so downregulating the body's immune system skews it a little bit. So our reactions to certain things that should be normal, for instance, foods or chemicals, or, the classic sort of histamine mast cell thing of petrol and perfumes and chemical sensitivity, our body becomes slightly dysregulated and starts to inappropriately react to things. And it's just because this mold is just wanting to survive, live within us and be cozy. And it's just got out of balance with our own kind of ecosystem within us. And we want to bring things back into balance so that it doesn't exert that effect. And you're right, people can become very, very scared, both by a high histamine foods, but also by the presence of molds once they discover that molds are an issue. And I think part of what we are really keen on doing in our practice is to bring it right down. Say, actually, you don't need to be scared of this. It's just part of normal life, and just relieve the stress and anxiety, because otherwise you end up perpetuating the cycle and making someone more anxious, more stressed, less likely to sleep, and then their histamine's off the scale again because of that anxiety. So it's a real art to doing that. And I don't think it's particularly helpful for people to be on these, hugely restrictive diets and really kind of going after things like mold with a laser, saying that we must eradicate all of it, because it's not necessary. You need to just bring your own terrain, your own body back into balance in order to be able to cope with it and have appropriate immune responses. And that's really fundamentally what it is. The body's gone out of balance. We need to bring it back into balance.
Yeah. And then by the other token, I mean, you're wearing an Oura ring there, aren't you? Is that
Yes,
right?
I do have an Oura ring, and you,
And
yes.
I do. I think I told you last time we spoke that in Thailand, my HRQ was my heart rate variability, which is a sign of health, really, was the highest it's ever been.
Yeah.
And it's just because I was stressing less, working less, and relaxing more. And I've always found the more I relax, the more holidays I take. For some people it may be a luxury. For me, it's an absolute necessity to live healthily, to just not work that hard. I just have to incorporate that. And that's something I've really brought back with me as well, just working less and finishing earlier in the day.
Yeah, and looking at things like the quality of your sleep, and have you got time to exercise or at least go outside? And I think that's where our lifestyles come into play, because it's gone so out of balance. And you look at all the stuff that you're supposed to be doing as well. So it's like you're supposed to be meditating, then you've got to go and exercise, you've got to get some daylight sun, between the hour, well, if the sun ever appears in this country, but between 11 and 3, you actually start to list the things that should be in your day as well. And that in itself becomes stressful because it's no longer a natural action. Like, with you being away, you'd go out, you'd eat healthily, you'd just naturally do that, you'd relax more. It's just a natural thing. But as soon as it becomes forced, then that doesn't work either, because it's just keeping you into this ticking the boxes of I've got to do this, I've got to do that, I've got to run to a yoga class to relax. Doesn't work, just doesn't work. We're just doing too much. We're just multitasking, trying to do too much at the same time, I think.
Funnily enough, I think that's one of the reasons it was such a transformative experience being away, because we didn't have that many friends out there. We just lived a sort of slightly quieter lifestyle. It would get to the weekend and we think, we've got no plans. This is great. Whereas normally you think, oh God, I've got to drive across London to go and see someone in the morning, and then I've got to come back in the afternoon. And so it's simple, really.
Yeah, it sounds simple, doesn't it? But then you transform yourself back here and it's really difficult to do.
Okay. Yeah, it is.
And it sounds really simple saying to someone, you just need to get some sleep. Honestly, I think if there was one thing I could resolve for people, it would be sleep, because I genuinely think that would transform so many people's lives. And, that's back to the Aura Ring. That's the benefit of having some of these trackers. Sometimes, to a certain point, is that you can actually see, are you going through those sleep stages? Are you getting your REM sleep? Are you getting the deep sleep? Or what actually is happening within that time? And it's very, very easy to say, go and eat well, go and get some sleep, have an early night. It's so much harder in practice. It really is.
Don't get kicked by a 4-year-old in the bed alongside you in the middle of the night, which was what woke me up last night anyway.
That's never good.
Yeah. But he likes snuggling up. It's amazing what a mammal he is. He's just, if he's not got some part of his body touching you, he's not happy.
Actually, my son used to be the same, and he would have his hand, like his arm around our necks in bed as well. Yeah, it's nice though. Yeah, make the most.
It's nice, but I mean, it's amazing how it works. I mean, if he's sort of stirring at 5:30 in the morning, you're thinking this is way too early for you to be waking up. I'll make sure I'm basically cuddling up to him, and he'll just go back to sleep, because then he's happy.
Yeah. Oh, that's nice.
It is nice. Yeah. Yeah. So in terms of histamine or mold or unexplained symptoms, what are sort of first steps for people who have probably heard about this, me talking about this stuff before, but might not have paid much attention? As you said, it's hard to find a histamine test that is actually going to work as such. But what do you recommend for people looking into this in a little bit more detail?
So the simplest thing is, I mean, there are lots. We have a general sort of low histamine handout that we give out, but there's lots of information about some of the higher histamine foods. The first thing that you could do, just from a experimental viewpoint, is take 7 to 10 days just to reduce the higher histamine foods in the diet. And it doesn't mean reducing everything, but it's just the heavy hitters. So things like strawberries, raspberries, bananas, tomatoes, spinach, the top ones, cashews in terms of nuts. Chocolate, unfortunately, is really high, and alcohol is, particularly sort of red wine and the ferments, are high. And kind of like kombucha, all the fermented stuff, kombucha, kefir, sauerkraut, all the stuff that is actually ultimately good for us. You could just do a little experiment for 7 to 10 days, because histamine is very much based around, you take it out, you'll notice if it's going to yield an effect. If you don't feel any effect from that, then I would question, is there particular value with going on with that sort of diet? But if you do, it's a sign that you may be looking at some sort of histamine intolerance. You can then work with, things such as, vitamin C. There are some good kind of natural antihistamine supplements out there. So obviously you've got antihistamine meds, which I don't advise on at all, because I'm not a prescriber, but certainly supplements, there's lots that can help to reduce. So you can play around with that. I would then say you kind of need some guidance around where to go next, because there can be many, many different triggers for the histamine. Unless you actually get to the root cause of why it's high to begin with, all you're doing is taking a layer away, which is, okay, that's lovely if it helps to alleviate symptoms right now, but it's not actually resolving anything.
Yeah.
So the very first place that we look and we start is with the gut to understand if you're digesting and whether or not you've got histamine producers in the gut, whether or not you've got any fungal overgrowth as well, because that stimulates histamine. So it's kind of starting around the gut and then onwards from there. So it's finding someone really to work with and to fine tune those areas initially. But there's a lot of, there's a lot you can play around with, but it's understanding what the trigger is. Is it purely that you've just got an issue in the gut that's triggering high histamine release in the body? Or is it more systemic than that? Is it something like toxins you're responding to, which could include mycotoxins, also includes other things as well.
Yeah.
And really working with your root cause. You've got to personalize it at the end of the day. Otherwise, all you'll do is just end up following low histamine, diet, as and then you're still fundamentally in the same place, a year later, 2 years later, 3 years later. You can address all the lifestyle stuff, sleep better, get moving, all the stuff that we know. But actually, as we just said, it's one thing knowing that you should do that, and another thing actually knowing where to start and what's most important.
Yeah, definitely. No, and listen, thank you, because it's been really great working with you on that, and I have made huge progress, and not sort of quite at the end stage yet, but because it is a process, isn't it? And also I can take quite a long time in actually doing the tests. I know sometimes you have to chase me up and say, Tony, we sent you those tests 6 months ago, get them done. But and then just on mold, that's another one where it's quite hard to. I've got one of these meters where you can measure damp in the water. Really, if you Google mold remediation, it's a lot of money to get people to come over to your house and do a lot of proper tests and then take the mold out. That is beyond most budgets, including mine at the moment.
Yeah, it is. So the first thing with mold, if you do think mold is a trigger, overriding all of this, the first thing is to remove yourself from any exposure, because if you have an exposure, it's just part of the cause of the problem. So the first thing, if you possibly can, is to get out of the exposure. It depends if you can see mold, if you can see that you've got damp and it's a very small patch, you can wear an appropriate mask. You can remove it. I wouldn't advise any of the commercial mold removing sprays and things, because they tend to contain bleach, which aggravates the mold, so it's a really bad plan. But things you can make up, and there's lots of ways you can do it with sort of white vinegar and water and some essential oils, depending on the where you're putting it, whether it's a hard surface. Obviously you're not going to spray that all over soft furnishings and things, but there's certain things you can do. You can use things like air purifiers. You can also take a look at the humidity in your house. So if you go onto one of the online shopping stores, you can just get super cheap humidity meters, like 5-10 quid, and it will tell you what the humidity level is in your house. And a humidity level, my understanding is that it should be maximum 60%, ideally much nearer 50% maximum. Things like kind of hanging washing around the house, how we heat the houses, how we don't ventilate the houses. So things like putting an extractor fan on when you have a shower, opening windows. And this is the problem. Our houses now aren't ventilated. Yeah. Whereas if you look back 100 years, they were drafty, they were cold, they had ventilation just because of poor building techniques, really. And now what we do is we insulate, we put things in. So that means that things like mold can't escape, but just by ventilating, by using like a HEPA vacuum. So HEPA scoops up all the really, really small particles as well. It can be easy things to do. So you're just keeping your environment clean, you're dusting, and just keeping on top of it as much as you can. And, for some people, that might be enough. If you've had sort of water damage, if you can get on top of it, if it's a small area, if it's an outside area and you can repair it, do that. But it just does very much, I think, depend on health symptoms and how ill someone is with it, as to how much they want to do at the end of the day. And then if you have got a big, if you're somewhere that's really damp and it's going to cost a load of money, it's that trade-off, isn't it, between actually it's your health, what do you want to do? Do you want to, what do you want to do? Do you want to throw money at it? Do you want to move? What do you want to do? And that's a very individual decision, I think.
So final questions. What is one book you'd recommend and one tip for living with more energy and vitality? So one book that's had a bit of an impact on you. I think you've recommended me a few over the last couple of years, but what is one book that you've enjoyed?
I mean, I love books. I forever am buying books and surrounded by new ones. So aside from all the motivational ones and everything, the book that I really recommend to a lot of people actually is around mold, and it's called Breaking the Mold by Dr. Jill Krister. So I certified with her as mold literate. There are a number of really excellent practitioners in the States, and I think over here we don't have as many people practicing within mold. But I think if someone wants to get a really good introduction to it and its effects on the body, it's a really nice one to read. It brings it all together comprehensively.
Okay, that's good. Since we last spoke, I've been reading Neil Nathan's.
Oh yes,
but I didn't realize you would recommend that one, so maybe I'll have a look at that.
I tell you what, I love Neil Nathan as well, but the reason I gravitate a little bit more towards Dr. Krister is because she works much more on a naturopathic basis.
Right.
So she's very into the let's just use, essential oils and
lovely
bud baths and, really kind of nice practical things that we can use. Whereas Dr. Nathan uses a lot more of the meds, which I personally can't recommend or use. And actually, I don't see a need to in many cases either. So that would be the difference there. But his stuff's great. Yeah,
brilliant. And then what about one tip for living with more energy and vitality?
My one tip is actually to get it. It sounds really simple, but it would literally just be to get outside in nature once a day, whatever you do, without fail, even if it's horrible weather. Go and find somewhere green, because I think with that, it calms you down. There's so much research around just staring at the picture of a forest lowers your cortisol levels, which they've used in many hospitals, in certain countries, certain private hospitals. But just actually getting outside in nature with a tree, doesn't matter if you live in a city, but just go find somewhere, even if it's for 5 minutes, because that's going to calm your stress levels down, and get the exposure to the air as well. Going to get better sleep due to production of melatonin. So it would literally be as simple as that.
Yeah. Oh, here, and it's hard, isn't it? Because it's not like this wild supplement that nobody's ever heard of.
It's not.
But
it's
it
really
definitely
simple.
works. Yeah.
And everyone can do it, so there's no excuse. It takes a bit of energy to actually force yourself outside, doesn't it? When it's cold and you think, oh, what's the point? What value is that going to be? But honestly, if there was one thing that everyone could do, it would be that.
Great. And Caroline, where can people find out more about you, and if they wanted to work with you or just find out more about what you do?
You can find out more. Our website is eatdrinklivewell.com. So you can just take a look at that. And my email is caroline@eatdrinklivewell.com. So very welcome to email me as well.
Awesome. It's been lovely to talk to you.
And to you.
We've been planning this for a long time. Thank you so much for coming.
I know. Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm glad we got to finally do it.
Thank you to Caroline. Thank you for listening as well. And if you are more interested in histamine intolerance, then go to my other site, not tonywhiten.com, but histamineintolerance.net. And there's a free report you can get there. It's a good starting point if you're just new to this world of histamine. It's 14 ways you can lower your histamine levels now. And that is what I use. All the stuff that I use to lower my histamine levels, it's all there. Also look up Caroline, of course, and check out my podcast partners, Histamine Friendly. For most people, I think you never quite know with histamine intolerance, but definitely most people seem to like a magnesium supplement and a magnesium breakthrough. magbreakthrough.com/zestology. It's a really good one. And I haven't had my magnesium supplement today because I've been out all day. So I haven't had my supplements. I'm going to go home now and have them. Thank you for listening. Do check out Mag Breakthrough. You'll get at least 10% off with the code Zestology10, but actually on that site, magbreakthrough.com/zestology, there are some much better offers if you buy in bulk, which I like to do, whether it's loo roll or magnesium breakthrough. That's it for this podcast. Thank you for listening, and I will see you next time.